Welcome. You are listening to the Be a Better Being podcast hosted by Michelle Zellner and Sasha Berscheid. Michelle and Sasha are here to give you information and inspiration to help you live your healthiest, happiest lives. Thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the show.
Greetings. Thank you for tuning into the Be a Better Being podcast. I'm Michelle Zellner, your host, joined today by two very beautiful ladies. One, my side host, Sasha. How are you, darling?
I'm great. Thank you so much.
Excellent. The other one, if you've been listening to our show, you are going to recognize my dear friend, Michelle Collins, has returned to us today. Welcome back, Michelle. How are you?
Thank you so much. It's great to see you. I'm doing really well.
Well, we are going to have what's probably going to be a bit of a heavy conversation, but hopefully, it's one that will really help people navigate something that probably at some point, if you haven't already, you're going to face, and that is dealing with loss and grief. If you've listened to Michelle's episode before, you know she was well versed in lots of things, and we didn't even scratch the surface of your story. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation today because August is National Wellness Month. We are wrapping up the month with this conversation because there's such a deep connection to our emotional well-being and to how we process grief. And I think it is something that we don't talk enough about. And I don't think we ever really learn the skill of grieving. So let's just give the audience a little bit of the history of why this is something that you are passionate about informing and inspiring and educating people on.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Michelle. Basically, what I found out both through the loss of my mother in 2007 and then the loss of my second husband in 2016 was a lot of the suffering that I went through was not just associated with the loss, but associated with the people that I was relying on to support me through grieving, not knowing what to do. The things that they would say and do were uneducated. And a lot of times it made my suffering worse. So after my husband died and I began recovering, which was several years, I decided that I wanted to study grief and go through a process of grief education. I actually have a certification in grief education and in grief yoga because I was already a yogi and a yoga therapist before these losses. And so it really helped me understand how uneducated we are as a society about grief, and especially with death. It's not just death that causes grief. We all, the planet went through grieving when we all went through the pandemic because all of our lives were affected in unexpected and undesirable ways. And people were grieving loss of work in the office, loss of their community, loss of freedom to move about the planet. And so it doesn't necessarily require a death, which is why grief is such an important thing to learn as far as the health, the health month and beyond. Part of being healthy is grieving well, and there's a way to do it. It's never easy to grieve. You always want what happened not to have happened. That's one of the definitions of grief. But if you're educated about it and the people around you, your supporters are educated, it can be a natural, normal unfolding and not such a terrible suffering.
Have you noticed that our culture as Americans are behind? Do you feel like there's other cultures that have a grasp on grief more so than other cultures? Or give me a little bit of insight on that.
Yeah, Sasha, that's a great question. And I didn't really understand fully the until I started studying grief sort of in an academic way. But there is a really big difference between cultures that, and I'm not going to say West, East, or, third world, because it's different. There's even cultures within America, different religions that manage grief in a more productive and open way. So I'm not going to divide the globe. It just depends on your background. But if grief is talked about, if there's open conversation, pre-death especially, I mean, none of us could have had a conversation pre-COVID, although I guess some experts knew it was coming, but to prepare So one of the things, David Kessler is my main man as far as teaching about grief goes. What he says is the grief mirrors the death. So if you have a good death, then the grief is often better, meaning less suffering. But back to answering your question more directly, yes, there are cultures out there where death is absolutely a part of life. And they talk about it, and they think of it as a sacred passage rather than a horrible tragedy. And it's so much healthier. I mean, I get that we're sad when we lose people. And sometimes, especially with a suicide, like my husband had, there's trauma associated with it. But trauma doesn't always have to be associated with grief. Sadness, of course, loss, of course. And if you're prepared, if you talk about it ahead of time and realize your life's going to change, and you have to accept that change in the best way that you can to get through your grief in the best way that you can. And it's the lack of acceptance and the lack of discussion and the, oh, death is the worst thing that could possibly happen. Well, I hate to break it to you, but none of us is getting out of here without one of those. So yes, we need to have a more open conversation. And yes, most of our Western culture does not do a good job of talking about preparing for or supporting after a death.
I will say I am probably an anomaly. I am almost 51 years old. I have not yet lost somebody who is very close to me. Years ago, when I did personal training, I had a client that I did in-home training for. She's probably my client for about 2 years, and she passed. And it was not surprising. She'd been battling ovarian cancer for many, many, many years. She was my first close connection to death. Died when I was 5. My dad's parents, I was not close to. They died when I was in my 20s, and we just weren't close. So they really didn't feel like a loss to me. And so when my client Rosemary passed away, and that was, I don't know, probably now at least 15 years ago, roughly, and still no loss until my sweet cat Axel. And I know it's not the same. A pet and a person are not the same. However, she was my closest connection, right? So
Was about to say, oh, okay, for some of you, this say is just a cast.
and so still not a lot of exposure personally. However, when I was a gymnast, my coaches, Phyllis and Dale actually taught university classes, and he wrote a book on death and dying. I believe that's actually the title, On Death and Dying. And the conversation around death was not a regular topic, but I remember my gymnastics coach, Phyllis, his wife, telling me that her mom was visiting and they're going to go coffin shopping. And we were like, what do you mean coffin shopping? Oh yeah, my mom wants to make sure that we know exactly what coffin she wants her body in. So we're going to go or make sure she fits, make sure it's the one she likes, make sure it's, made the way she likes it to make. And it was such a lighthearted kind of just like, yeah, we're going to go buy a new dress. The way she talked about it was kind of a first introduction for me, even on the subject, because again, there's not really been much death in my family, really. And I know that's unique. So let's go into why we don't have these conversations. What are some of the things that you see that people just don't talk about it? Why?
Well, I think mostly because of fear, certainly because of denial. I mean, in yoga, we talk about the 5 kleshas, and one of those are the kleshas are what interferes with your ability to be enlightened, say, if you believe in that. And one of them is fear of death. And if you think about the conversation we've had so far up to this point, being afraid of something that is going to there are very few things we know are absolutely going to happen that we're afraid of, right? Anxiety is fear of something that usually doesn't happen. And death is 100% going to happen. Yet still we greet it with fear more than anything else. And I think that it's fear of the pain of loss because we don't know how to deal with pain. We are a comfort seeking society. We don't want to be too hot or too cold. We don't want to be too tired or too hungry. It's the quick fix society, right? And so I think that it's really pain avoidance And another thing, I'm guessing everyone listening to this podcast, including you two beautiful hosts, you've felt pain and you've survived it, and you felt fear and you've survived it. And when you feel the pain of loss, you have to know it's coming and survive it. Even if you don't know it's coming, that specific thing, like I didn't know my husband was going to end his life, but I knew you always know some challenge is going to come before you. So I think it's just that we don't have the open conversation about what to do when these challenges hit, because they're going to.
Mhm.
And
So,
I wanted to say one thing about something you talked about, Michelle, and that is it's just a cat. The thing is, everyone feels grief. And there's no easy grief, hard grief. My grief is worse than your grief. I got so many people comparing, oh, my husband died too, but it was a long, slow illness and it was nothing like what you went through. Well, the fact is you don't know how I feel. You don't know the depth of my pain and loss, and I don't know the depth of your pain and loss. Your loss of your cat may be way more deep than some people's loss of a family member. Like you were casually mentioning, you lost your grandparents in your 20s and you weren't close to them. To some people, the loss of their grandparents was absolutely the devastating thing that happened in their life. So I don't want you to belittle and say just a cat. It can
Well,
be anything.
let me say, I didn't say just a cat for me. I said just a cat with air quotes
Mm,
for people who are like, oh, it's just a cat. Trust me, I
yeah.
don't see it as just a cat. I understand connection is connection is connection, no matter who or what it's with. And
Yeah.
when you lose it, I'm getting ready to let go of a property I've had for 20 years that has a lot of connection to me. I know that when that closing day comes, as happy as I am going to be to wipe my hands of it, there is going to be a mourning and a grieving period
Yeah.
of that because of all the things that that property symbolizes. Right. And so
Yeah.
I totally get it. And I'm glad you articulated it that way so that anybody listening who maybe doesn't get it, maybe they do get it now.
Yeah. I mean, grief, and this is why it is so bad for our health, let's say. It's because, so Michelle, that when you let go of that property on closing day, when it is no longer your property, that you're going to have a grief and mourning period. You are prepared emotionally that that's going to happen. Now, what I'm going to challenge you to do is take care of your grief. Take the next step. Create a ritual, plan an event with a friend where you go out and if you drink champagne or drink a cup of coffee and cheers to the old property and talk about it, just like you would if you lost a human, or just like you did when you lost your cat, I hope. And that's back to Sasha's question. That's what we don't have in our society is I mean, in certainly some religions, I'm Jewish, and Judaism does do a very nice, beautiful series of rituals during the first year after a death. But most of us don't have this sort of guidepost or guidelines, and we don't plan. And if you don't plan ahead, well, when you're in grief, it's really hard to plan anything. And then you're relying on your friends to come say, hey, let's go through this ritual to really help you transition from having had to not having had, from wishing you had to accepting that you don't have. And that's so important. We need a ritual. We need something to do, someone to talk to, if it's a grief coach like me or a counselor, a friend, and a plan. What am I going to do? Like if you cremate, then spreading the ashes can be just an incredibly deep, rich, fulfilling ritual. A funeral, traditional funeral certainly can too. But you need to prepare. And if you don't think about it ahead of time, and then you lose someone or something, and then you're in grief, that's not a good time to make a decision. So kudos to your friend whose mom was coffin shopping, because when she dies, your friend isn't going to have to make a decision with grief brain. That's the
Yeah.
hardest. It's so hard to make a decision when you're grieving.
So the loss or like the life death cycle has been something that always interests me because it is inevitable. One of, if not my closest friend, her name is Stacy. She's the gal that I went to Chile with. She's the gal that I do all of my traveling with. Her best buddy in the entire world, her number one champion, the person that she leans on the most, very much like Michelle, is her dad. And every time we go on vacation, I have made it a point and I said, Stacy, let's talk about Dennis. Let's talk about when Dennis passes. Let's talk about how that will also be one of the most difficult days for me because I have observed the love and the space that you hold for your dad and your dad holds for you. Now, I haven't started this conversation with Michelle, but I am assuming that the more and more that we spend and time together in the flesh, that those will be conversations that I want to start having with Michelle so that, we can normalize grief. I don't want to spend this entire conversation talking solely on death because like you had mentioned within the first few sentences of your introduction, there are so many different types of grief. I think it's important that we talk about all those different types of grief. But the one thing that with my closing when it comes to death and the reason why I asked about the cultural differences is my mother, she's El Salvadorian. And, the day that I lose my mother, just like everyone else that I hear, is the day that you lose your mother, a part of you dies as well. So I am not ready, mother, if you're listening, which I know you are, you're not ready. This is not a hint. This is not no, ma'am, we're not ready. Like we got a good another 60 years on us, mother, together. Okay. But one of the most beautiful things that they do in Salvador, is they have auxiliadorias, auxiliaries. And it's basically like an apartment or a condo that you rent out as a family. There's a giant main area where you can go in and visit the body. It's a visitation area. The body stays with the family for, however many days that you rent out the space. And then there's a little apartment area in the back. There's a kitchenette so that the family can be with the body for however many days. I think our family had 4 or 5 days with my grandmother when she passed. And then you do have your final ceremony and everything there. Well, I had never experienced, as an American living individual, I had never experienced anything like that. And I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. And so if you were to look back at my pictures in 2013 is when she passed, I took hundreds of pictures of this whole process because I was fortunate enough to be there in the flesh with my mother during this entire process of paying homage and moving the body on, with the celebration of life and the ceremony and everything. But my cousins were not. And so I wanted to capture every single little thing that was going on so that also that I got to experience, my cousins could experience. Then, my sisters or even the family, all her siblings went, but like extended family or friends and such. And even wanted to educate my friends that were here in the United States to say, like, look how cool this is. And this is what should be so normal. And this is what we should be doing instead of just like a 45-minute, like, yes, this was a good person, and whatever it is that we have here. And someday I've told my husband this, I said, I would love to open one of those here because that's not just a Central America thing. There are so many different cultures that do something similar to that, where they stay with the body or they have whatever, I can't say it in English, but just a service, an extended 4 or 5 day service. And so, yeah, I think that's very important. If you don't know how to talk about death with your close friends, or if you see someone who's really close with maybe their family, just start talking about it. Just start normalizing it.
Yeah, excellent advice. So you have what we would call in the grief world a high grief IQ because of what you said about your friend and your experiences. You talk about death without fear. And that's what we need more of. Because how can something that happens to every single person be so terrifying? It's as normal as it gets. I mean, The,
But
you know?
I think that the fear is often the people who are alive are afraid of losing the people they love, because how am I going to function in this pain and in this sadness? Right.
Right.
And there are some people who fear their own death, right? I can't
Sure.
say, am I looking forward to the act of dying? No. I mean, I'm sure it's not going to be comfortable unless it's like a take me out quick and I don't feel anything, which I think we all hope that's the way we go, right? So for me personally, me dying, I'm not afraid of that. I'm not looking forward to what version it looks like. I hope it's not anytime soon. But I think the fear is, how am I going to function when this person is no longer physically here in my life? Right. So it's a very selfish thing. It's a very selfish thing to not talk about it, to fear it, because it's all about, well, how am I going to be okay? And I feel like that is, like you said, we're just pain adverse. We don't like discomfort. And if we pretend like it's not going to happen, then we can avoid it, except you can't avoid it. And then it
No.
smacks you in the face, and now you don't know what to do with it. Or, we're too busy here in America, Sasha, to spend 4 or 5 days with a dead person's body. We don't have time for that. I got to go to work. I got to take care of the kids. I got to go on my vacation. I'm fine. I got to get on with life. Right. So that's kind
Which
of what
is
we do.
which is exactly why we are so
Yeah.
inept at grief,
Yeah.
You
because
know,
we do have to stop and honor the loss. And when we don't, it comes back to bite us, weeks, months, years later. We have grief goes in like an injury. So when I'm talking to, and I wrote about this in my book, when I'm talking to my grief groups or coaching, I say, well, if you broke your leg and then your friend said, hey, let's go hiking tomorrow, doesn't that sound absurd? So same thing, your physical leg isn't broken, but grief causes damage that you need to sit and give attention to and let it heal. So a lot of people are saying, well, my friends just want me to go right back to coffee or right back to my tennis group or right back to whatever it is that, and I don't feel like I can't go back to work, 3 days of bereavement leave after your husband died. I mean, what is that? If you had a heart attack, you wouldn't have to go back to work for 2 months. Well, grief can be even more devastating than a heart attack, depending on the situation. So,
I'm so
doesn't
glad you just said heart attack because I've been waiting. I was been going in and out of our little my mute here. So, Michelle, you say, I'm not worried or I'm not so much scared about death. And my father had a heart attack 3 months ago, maybe something like that. And up until then, putting on blast. Number one, no, he's not listening to this, but putting my dad on blast, right? And all my life, he would say, just when I get to be 85, because he's just I wouldn't say insensitive, but like, this is like his humor, but also just who he is. Okay. This is just who my dad is. He said, when I get 85, just take me out back and do away with me. And I'm like, oh my God, dad, like all my life, like that is what I have just dealt with my dad's grief. So here he comes 3 months ago having a heart attack, and his outlook on death is completely different now. He has so much anxiety revolved around it. He is worried that he hasn't accomplished all the things that he wanted to accomplish. He has just an overwhelming sense of anxiety 3 days after he had his heart attack. So we live in Omaha. He lived in Randolph, which is about 2.5 hours away from here. And 2 days after he got released from the hospital, he was driving home and he had to turn around and come back to our home. And he was like, I'm afraid that if I get there, that I'm going to have another heart attack and I'll die. And I was like, what? Who is this man? So I've also got to watch, my father process all of a sudden you are inevitably going to die. And now you do have anxiety. Oh, look, Herbert is human. So it's just, that is one little thing that I found interesting, because some people, we think we're not afraid of death and dying. We are most certainly afraid of that displacement of love, right? I love this person so much, but I have nowhere for this love to go because that person is gone now. It's that grief. But now you, I might even say I'm not afraid to die, but I think given that chance to look death in the eye, it's like, okay, maybe I am afraid to die.
Well, and I think I want to kind of piggyback off what you said is your dad realized maybe some regrets, right? So, I mean, do I have any regrets in life? Probably. I could probably write out a few. Do I have very many? I don't. And that is only because in the last 15 years, I've worked really hard to live my life with intention. I've worked really hard to be the best version of me I can, to connect with people that matter, to spend my time, money, and energy intentionally on things that matter because I could be dead tomorrow. Nobody knows, right? I hope not, but I could
Nobody
be.
knows.
And I don't want to get to that point. And that is the point a lot of people get to when they realize they are dying. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh,
Or
I wish I
facing
would have.
facing
If,
it. Right.
right.
Like
If
Sasha's dad
only.
had a little brush. Sasha, how far out from 85 is your dad?
20 years.
Oh, all right. Well, it'll be interesting. Get back to me in 20 years when he reaches 85. I want to hear what he says.
Yeah, I definitely will. I mean, so, but let's go back to talking about grief, right? Because when Michelle was like, okay, today we're talking about grief, I was like, perfect, let's do this. Thinking not even about death, but grieving the life that I had anticipated that I was going to have with Kyan is basically the deepest form of grief that I have ever experienced, right? And it took me a very long time to get through that grief. So, Michelle, my daughter has level 3 autism, and I was sold the dream of the Disney mom, Disney daughter, hairbrushing, teacup, nail painting, the hey mom, hey mom, hey mom, hey mom. Like that is what I had anticipated for my daughter. And so for the listeners that, okay, maybe we've talked about death. It's going to happen, guys. We're going to be talking about death and grief a lot more, but like, let's talk about the other forms of grief.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really great point. And I think that we all when we start anything new, I don't want to say just when we're pregnant with a child, but starting a new project on a house, bringing a child into the world or an adoption or a new pet, whatever it might be, we have the expectation that it is going to be the Disney dream. And so I have a friend who had a daughter with Down syndrome, and we've talked a lot over the years about how that was one of the worst things is you expect your baby to come out perfect. You expect your relationship, when you get married, it's all going to be great. And so when things turn out to be real in a different way, accepting that new reality is definitely going to require a grieving process for sure. Children with autism, my best friend from, 7th, 8th grade, her son had a stroke at birth, and that was her first child. And so he's not autistic, but he's got a lot of disabilities. And, there's a grieving process that you have to go through to realize this is your person. This is your child. It's just not the child that you had expected or planned for.
And let's talk about what that process actually looks like.
Yeah. Well, again, depending on what you're grieving, and who you are and what your resilience level is coming into it, it's different for everyone. Just like every relationship is different. So I know that that's not really a useful answer. So what the useful answer I'm going to give you is what to do when you realize you're grieving. And like Sasha said, she didn't get her Disney dream. And you could just be angry about that. Just, pick an emotion. I'm sure you've had them all. But I think what's important is to realize there is a grieving process there. Once you realize there's a grieving process going on, and it can be something like you didn't get the job you wanted, then you have to, I shouldn't say have to, but you can, if you want to, be consciously grieving, learn about grief, go through a process of grieving. And that can be, again, different, but make sure it's attended to. If you're conscious to your loss, conscious to what you wanted and didn't get and what you have now, and work towards acceptance of what you have, then, or what you lost, then that can be your grieving process. Now, you know, the 5 stages of grief, which are now 6 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler put together: anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and finding meaning. So what you could do if you wanted to do an actual exercise, how is my grief? Where am I grieving? You can make a list of those 6 things. You can write out those 6 things. Anger. Have I felt anger? Okay. And then for me, because I'm a meditation teacher, mindfulness teacher, and yogi, I figure out, how can I process anger? And there's different meditations I can do, different yoga poses I can do, different, some people run, some people punch a pillow. Grief yoga is amazing. You really process the feelings. And then denial. Am I in denial? Am I still saying my husband's alive? Bargaining, depression, go through all of those things. And then, of course, you may have 20 other stages, and the stages are not in any order or anything, but you could do that process. And a grief coach like me can help you with that, or you can go to grief groups. There's lots of different things. But the main thing to do is to start out with awareness. I am suffering. Why am I suffering? I'm suffering because I lost my future. I lost the future that I had planned for my child, or I had planned for my marriage. That's lost. Okay. How do I feel about it? And then work through those feelings. And those, you may have to go through that same thing over and over and over again. But eventually, when you're ready, when you're healthy enough and you've found healthy outlets and ways to process your emotions, you can feel better, suffer less. And then, like David Kessler says, as far as grief goes, you have gotten, I call it equilibrium when I write and talk about it, because I don't think you ever stop grieving. But when you reach the state where the love outweighs the pain, that's the equilibrium. And that's more specifically for death, but maybe for a situation like the future that you're grieving that you didn't get. It's acceptance. When you get to acceptance and you can be there more than not. Again, it's a stage, it's a process. You're not going to arrive one day. Like, I didn't arrive one day after my mom passed of leukemia and say, oh, I've accepted my mother's death. I still come in and out of it. I'm pissed. I loved her. She was my person, and I have grieved her, but do I still wish every day I could have more time with her? Absolutely. Does that mean I haven't really gone through a full grieving process about her? No, I have.
Well, and I think that's a really important point to highlight, is there is no finish line, right? This isn't a linear thing. And very often, because of who we are as creatures, and probably even more so as creatures living in Western society, we just want to get back to normal, right? We just want to bypass the process. And this is like,
Yeah.
we have this conversation no matter what the topic. We don't want to do the process. We just want the outcome. And
Right.
Michelle, I'm pretty sure it was on our first conversation where I said, if you don't own your emotions now, they will own you later.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and that is always what happens, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
to
Well,
be
one
able
of
to
my meditation teachers always says that if you have an emotional insult, like a death or a illness or heart, whatever it might be, the incident, and you don't give yourself a chance to process it, and you just go on, that 9 months later, you're going to get a diagnosis. I didn't really like him saying that, because that sounded really gloom and doom to me. Like, I want more than 9 months to be able to deal, but that's his belief. So,
Well, and I think it's that you're engaging in the process, right? You didn't get to the finish line, but that you're actually doing the work. Like
yeah.
so many, times we say you got to do the work. You can't bypass stages of it, because if you do, they're going to come back to get you at some point. but also everybody does go at a different pace and does it in a different way. So in the beginning, you had talked about how people didn't know what to say. They weren't helpful. Things that they did or said actually were harmful. Can you talk about what some of those specifics were and maybe how we can educate people on how to interact with somebody who has experienced loss?
Yes, and thank you so much for that question. That's really what's motivated me to be in the position that I am now, to have written my 2 books. Well, so I wrote a book about suicide loss, and then as soon as I turned the draft into my publisher, that night, like, you turn in your draft and you think it's party time or relaxation time. It took me 5 years to do that. That night, I got a message from Spirit, or whatever you want to call it, that said I have to write a companion book for people to know what to do to support a suicide loss survivor. I didn't want that message that night, but I get how important it is. So that's kind of been my mantle, my soapbox that I've been on, to educate people how to support a griever. So I'm really glad that you asked that question. The first thing grievers need is witnessing. So if you can witness, just be with the griever. That's the first thing they need. They don't need to be cheered up. They don't need to be told, oh, you'll get over it. Or young widows are our favorite bitches. Everyone's like, oh, you're young, you'll find someone else. Don't say that. And I actually have a whole list in my book supporting a survivor of spouse or partner suicide loss. I have a whole list of do and don't do, say and don't say. And it's just a fraction of the things that I heard and that my friends did, that they were, everyone has the best intentions. They're just not educated. So number one, witness someone's pain. And if that's too much for you, make sure that they have somebody else who can be there and witness their pain. Because again, back to the earlier conversation, we aren't educated. We don't know how to sit with someone and watch them cry. We always want to stop it. Oh, no, it's okay. Well, the fact is, if someone's in grief, it's not okay. And it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be angry or depressed or in denial or sad or whatever. It's okay to lay in bed for a week. It is. And we just don't let people do that. Or, we do, Sasha's example is perfect. In Judaism, we do what's called sitting Shiva. And it is 100% witnessing. We sit in our house, a lot of, depending on how traditional you are, you wear torn clothes, you sit on the floor, you cover all the mirrors. People come and bring food and pray with you. And they sit with you and witness your grief. You tell stories about your lost loved one. And they care for all your physical needs, because you do need to do that. If you're going to lay in bed for a week, just make sure you're eating and drinking and using the bathroom and these things. But yeah.
When I was in treatment in 2012 for alcohol, people would start crying, going off this witness, people would start crying. And our first instinct is, when someone's crying, what do?
Stop
you hand them a tissue, a Kleenex, a napkin, or whatever. And in our circles during treatment, they would say, you guys are not allowed to go get them a Kleenex. So that's one thing that I did. I learned so many things from treatment, including I cannot drink. But that is one thing that I even still practice to this day. I see someone cry, I'm not going to go get you a napkin. No, I'm not cold-hearted, and I am not a bad person. I learned that the hard way. People need to cry it out.
Pain is okay. We don't want it permanently, but back to the broken leg example, or maybe you had a hip replacement. Your supportive friends aren't going to say, hey, Michelle, you had a hip replacement yesterday. Let's go for a hike. Let's hit the gym. So, but they'll come over and bring you stuff and sit with you in your pain.
And with that analogy, this is perfect, because I did have a hip replacement. And no, I didn't go for a hike the next day, but I actually was physically capable of walking without a cane relatively soon. And I had so many people, Michelle, you don't have to break a record. Michelle, there's no rush to get yourself. I'm like, I know what I can handle, and I know what I can do. So in the same space, if you are grieving, and you want to go for a hike because that makes you feel good, go for a hike. You
Right.
want to get up and go to coffee with your friend like you normally do, go to coffee with your friend like you normally do. That's
Right.
the thing is, hopefully you do know yourself best. Sometimes we don't.
Hmm.
But and this is where it can get very tricky because I might project onto you what I would do for me, right? So people who are
Right.
not in maybe my physical space would not be walking without a cane 4 days after a hip replacement. But you are not me and I'm not you. So
Yeah.
don't tell me not to do that. I know me. And this is where it can get really difficult, which I think it is helpful when you actually have connections, right? The better you know your people, the more authentic your relationships are, the more you're probably going to know how to support that person, whether it's a physical, mental, or emotional injury.
Well,
And
and the
if
way
you,
that oh, sorry, go ahead.
and I was going to say, if you don't know, then you ask.
Witnessing. That's what I was
Right.
going to say. The way you know is by witnessing and understanding that this person has a process to go through, whether it's 4 days, 4 weeks, 4 years. There are people in my grief groups who leave after 6 months and come back as a grief educator and are moderating grief groups in a year. And then there's people in the grief groups who have been in there for years and years and years and aren't ready to move to that next phase if ever. And that's okay. That's the other thing. So after you witness, you need to then just be okay with it. Don't think about, oh, I'm uncomfortable because my friend can't go hiking with me, or I'm uncomfortable because my friend isn't doing what I think she should be doing after her injury. No, you need to set yourself aside if you want to support a griever. And maybe you have to be in the discomfort with them and witness. And that's when you can figure out what support they need, but don't go against their grief, you know? And two things I want to say really quick. First of all, Sasha, congratulations. This month is my 5-year sober versary. So I can relate to that. And I know how difficult it is and how rewarding it is to be sober. So you go, girl. And then the second thing, and in a lot of those recovery programs, there is a lot of emotional intelligence teaching. So that goes far beyond just learning how to, it's self-awareness. It's beyond just you and the addiction. So that's a good piece. And the other thing that I wanted to say was just that the more resilient you are, the easier it is to sit with people. So a lot of us don't have any resilience, which brings us back to health and well-being. If we keep ourselves as healthy and well and whole as we can, then we can offer better support to our people that we're trying to support. And we're not, oh my gosh, I just want to tell a really quick story to illustrate this, because I think stories illustrate so much more than my didactics. When my mom got diagnosed with leukemia, I was devastated. It was like my whole world had turned upside down. I had 3 little kids, 1, 4, and 7, and my mom was my person. I 100% relied on her. She punctuated every event in my life with a phone call. I called her on the way to preschool. I called her after preschool drop off. I had lunch with her almost every day. I mean, she was absolutely keeping me together in that through that. So when she got diagnosed, it was a complete 180, right? All of a sudden, I was taking care of her. So I lost all my support from her and needed to then add her to my group of people I cared for. And I cried, like a lot, most days, most of the time. And a friend of mine that I also had a kid in the same preschool was avoiding me, and I noticed she had been avoiding me. I mean, I cried at drop off. I cried. That was my response. So I get that it's hard to witness that. You don't want people walking around the preschool hallway crying. Adults anyway. The kids are going to cry anyway. So one day she stopped me in the hallway and she put her hand on my shoulder and looked me in the eye and she said, Michelle, I'm sorry I haven't been there for you, but it hurts me. It upsets me too much to see you cry. That's not supporting. That's not supportive. And I mean, I didn't say anything at the time. I was just shocked. But my next response after she had already left was, I was furious. Oh, I'm so sorry that my dying mom is bothering you. I mean, I just got pissed. So the reason I tell that story is because it illustrates she could not face emotions, my emotions, to the point that she really dropped out of my life. I mean, my mom was in treatment for 3.5 years before she died. It was a long haul, and it ended our friendship. So there is that extreme that I hope no one listening to this podcast would ever have that going on with them. That my thought now is I have so much compassion for her. She must have been going through such a difficult time and had so little support and so little resilience that seeing me cry devastated her. So I think keeping yourself healthy, aware of your emotional state and emotional health, and building your resilience where you can, not just physically. And that's the stuff Michelle talks about too, in her book and her programs, mind and body. It's so important. It's not just a physical thing that you're walking around in. You have to support yourself with emotional, mental, spiritual.
Well, and I think that, that story does illustrate how we don't learn emotions. We don't learn emotional intelligence. We are not taught those things, right? We might be afforded the opportunity to develop them, but unless you're self-aware enough to know that that's an opportunity to develop it and then to develop it, you don't. And which is why I think putting the conversation on facing emotions, understanding emotions, owning emotions, talking about emotions, processing through the emotions that are no longer helpful, and then recognizing emotions in others and knowing and how to do all of that. I mean, I think we're probably going to be getting better at it because we are having the conversations, and so much of our mental health is impacted by all of this too, right? So I think the more
100%.
we're having the conversations about mental health, physical health, emotional intelligence, all of it, this human operates as one thing. And so you build in one area, it's going to probably have a positive impact in another area. But like everything else, you have to do the work. And, you recognize that probably she didn't have the capacity. I wonder if she ever recognized that. If she ever recognized it and thought, wow, what is so hard about seeing no, I don't like to see anybody cry either. I don't like to see anyone in
It's
pain.
uncomfortable.
Of course. And yet it's a real normal human emotion. So would I be uncomfortable if you were laughing? I mean, if you were having joy, would that make me uncomfortable? Probably not.
I hope not.
I mean, right? So it's normalizing normal human emotions because they are normal.
Right.
Gosh.
It's part of being human. And so mindfulness, my kind of focus now in my world is using mindfulness to help with all of these things. It is the awareness of the emotions. So the reason that mindfulness can be so incredibly useful in all of these situations is because instead of being angry, I'm angry, you can take a step back and be the observer and say, I'm feeling anger. And it gives you a moment to work with your anger and as something that isn't controlling you, like what you said earlier, Michelle. I love that line, and I want you to say it again so I can remember it. But you're not a victim of your emotions. You realize you're having them. You learn an intelligent way of processing them, moving them through. Realize that feeling emotions, whatever they are, is first of all temporary, and second of all not damaging if you let them go. It's part of the ride, part of the human ride, all of them. not just the good ones.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I feel like we could talk for hours on this. We probably should wrap it up here soon. Sasha, anything you want to add or ask before we give Michelle the final thoughts?
Yeah, the only thing that I have to add when it comes to grief, and I will say suffering, is the way to less suffering is through suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Thich Nhat Hanh, a very famous monk, Tibetan monk, has a book out there called No Mud, No Lotus. And I love this book. And it's a really small book. So I got it thinking, oh, how easy will it be to read this book? And it's all about how to suffer well. Because in Buddhism, the number one tenet is there is suffering. And so how do we manage our suffering? And that's back to resilience and all the other things we talked about. But if you haven't read No Mud, No Lotus, pick it up. It could be a life changer.
What about your 2 books?
My 2 books. Thank you for asking. So in January, my 2 books were released: Surviving Spouse or Partner Suicide Loss, A Mindful Guide for Your Journey Through Grief. And then its partner for supporters is Supporting a Survivor of Spouse or Partner Suicide Loss, Mindful Guide for Co-Journeying Through Grief. And those both came out in January. I have a few other books out that I supplied a chapter to, and those are all about the stuff we've been talking about: resilience, getting through difficult times, rebuilding your life after tragedy and loss. And you can find, I'm sure my website, Amazon author page and stuff will be in the show notes. But
yes,
I wrote the suicide loss books because it was exactly what I needed to hear when I went through. If I would have had a book like this, or a friend of mine would have had a book like this earlier on, I think that I would have suffered a lot less, because I would have, first of all, understood that I was part of a group, because you feel so alone. You feel like you're the only person who's ever suffered this loss. And it's just not true. I mean, every grieving is individual, but there is a community of people out there who can understand. And I would have gone and found them, and I would have been nicer to myself and nicer to my, more understanding to all the people that were disappointing me by not supporting me because they didn't know how. And yeah, it just would have made everything so much easier. So I wrote these 2 books to hopefully help someone.
Well, and I know they're going to. And Michelle, I mean, number 1, thank you for coming back on and sharing all of this. And number 2, thank you for writing those books, because I met you when you were at the very beginning of writing the first one.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, just to have to even revisit and relive it all and think about it all and go through it all. And, it's a hard book to write, right? I mean, and that you poured your heart and soul into it to help others. I mean, and whether you're suffering, because of suicide loss or not, loss is loss. There are going to be tips in there that are helpful for everybody. So thank you for always having such amazing things to share. I know there's going to be a lot in here that people are going to take to heart and hopefully maybe take some actions on. If you're listening and you've lost anything and you realize that you did not allow yourself to grieve, reach out to Michelle. She can help you get started, or help you even just iron some things out to see if you know how to do it yourself. But go through the process, because if you don't, eventually it's going to impact probably a lot of elements of your physical, mental, and emotional well-being. So with that, I am going to officially wrap us up. Everybody, both of you, thank you. Beautiful as always. And everybody listening, thank you. This is the end of National Wellness Month episodes, but this is not the end of the wellness conversations, because that's what the Be a Better Being podcast is all about. So hopefully by now it's your turn to go and be a better being.
Thank you for listening to the Be a Better Being podcast. Michelle and Sasha hope that what you heard today inspires you to embrace this journey of life with an open mind, a kind heart, and a willingness to learn and evolve. If you enjoyed the content, please help spread their message by subscribing, sharing, and leaving a 5-star review. If you have a show topic idea or would like to be a guest, please visit betterbeings.net and fill out a contact form. Until next time, go and be a better being.